Brought to you by Wikivideo Documentaries. Wallis Simpson. Wallis, Duchess of Windsor, commonly known by her second married name of Wallis Simpson and previously as Wallis Spencer, was an American socialite whose intended marriage to the British King Edward VIII caused a constitutional crisis that led to Edward's abdication. Wallis' father died shortly after her birth, and she and her widowed mother were partly supported by their wealthier relatives. Her first marriage, to U.S. naval officer Win Spencer, was punctuated by periods of separation and eventually ended in divorce. In 1931, during her second marriage, to Ernest Simpson, she met Edward, then Prince of Wales. 5 years later, after Edward's accession as King of the United Kingdom, Wallis divorced her second husband to marry Edward. The king's desire to marry a woman who had two living ex-husbands threatened to cause a constitutional crisis in the United Kingdom and the Dominions, and ultimately led to his abdication in December 1936 to marry the woman I love. After abdicating, the former king was created Duke of Windsor by his brother and successor, King George VI. Edward married Wallis 6 months later, after which she was formally known as the Duchess of Windsor, without the style, Her Royal Highness. She was instead styled as Her Grace, a style normally reserved for non-royal dukes and duchesses. Before, during, and after the Second World War, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were suspected by many in government and society of being Nazi sympathizers. In 1937, they visited Germany and met Adolf Hitler. In 1940, the Duke was appointed governor of the Bahamas, and the couple moved to the islands until he relinquished the office in 1945. In the 1950s and 1960s, the Duke and Duchess shuttled between Europe and the United States, living a life of leisure as society celebrities. After the Duke's death in 1972, the Duchess lived in seclusion and was rarely seen in public. Her private life has been a source of much speculation, and she remains a controversial figure in British history. Early life. An only child, Bessie Wallace Warfield was born in Square Cottage at Monterey Inn, a hotel directly across the road from the Monterey Country Club, in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania. A summer resort close to the Maryland-Pennsylvania border, Blue Ridge Summit was popular with Baltimoreans escaping the season's heat, and Monterey Inn, which had a central building as well as individual wooden cottages, was the town's largest hotel. Her father was Teakle Wallace Warfield, the fifth and youngest son of Henry McDear Warfield, a flour merchant described as one of the best known and personally one of the most popular citizens of Baltimore, who ran for mayor in 1875. Her mother was Alice Montague, a daughter of stockbroker William Latane Montague. Wallis was named in honor of her father and her mother's elder sister, Bessie, and was called Bessie Wallace until at some time during her youth the name Bessie was dropped. According to a wedding announcement in the Baltimore Sun, her parents were married by Reverend C. Ernest Smith at Baltimore's St. Michael and All Angels Protestant Episcopal Church on the 19th of November 1895, though Wallis claimed her parents were married in June 1895. Her father died of tuberculosis on the 15th of November 1896. For her first few years, she and her mother were dependent upon the charity of her father's wealthy bachelor brother Solomon Davis Warfield, postmaster of Baltimore, and later president of the Continental Trust Company and the Seaboard Airline Railway. Initially, they lived with him at the 4-story row house, 34 East Preston Street, that he shared with his mother. In 1901, Wallis' Aunt Bessie Merriman was widowed, and the following year Alice and Wallis moved into her 4-bedroom house on West Chase Street, Baltimore, where they lived for at least a year until they settled in an apartment, and then a house of their own. In 1908, Wallis' mother married her second husband, John Freeman Raisin, son of a prominent Democratic Party boss. On the 17th of April 1910, Wallis was confirmed at Christ Episcopal Church, Baltimore, and between 1912 and 1914 her uncle Warfield paid for her to attend Oldfields School, the most expensive girls' school in Maryland. There she became a friend of heiress Renee Dupont, a daughter of Senator T. Coleman Dupont of the Dupont family, and Mary Kirk, whose family founded Kirk Silverware. A fellow pupil at one of Wallis' schools recalled, "She was bright, brighter than all of us. She made up her mind to go to the head of the class, and she did. Wallis was always immaculately dressed and pushed herself hard to do well, a later biographer wrote of her. Though Wallis' jaw was too heavy for her to be counted beautiful, her fine violet blue eyes and petite figure, quick wits, vitality, and capacity for total concentration on her interlocutor ensured that she had many admirers. First marriage. In April 1916, Wallis met Earl Winfield Spencer Jr., a U.S. Navy aviator, at Pensacola, Florida, while visiting her cousin Corinne Mustin. It was at this time that Wallis witnessed two airplane crashes about 2 weeks apart, resulting in a lifelong fear of flying. The couple married on the 8th of November 1916 at Christ Episcopal Church in Baltimore, which had been Wallis' parish. Win, as her husband was known, was a heavy drinker. He drank even before flying and once crashed into the sea, but escaped almost unharmed. After the United States entered the First World War in 1917, Spencer was posted to San Diego as the first commanding officer of a training base in Coronado, known as Naval Air Station North Island. They remained there until 1921. In 1920, Edward, the Prince of Wales, visited San Diego, but he and Wallis did not meet. Later that year, Spencer left his wife for a period of 4 months, but in the spring of 1921 they were reunited in Washington, D.C., where Spencer had been posted. They soon separated again, and in 1922, when Spencer was posted to the Far East as commander of the, Wallis remained behind, continuing an affair with an Argentine diplomat, Felipe de Espel. In January 1924, she visited Paris with her recently widowed cousin Corinne Mustin, before sailing to the Far East aboard a troop carrier. The Spencers were briefly reunited until she fell ill, after which she returned to Hong Kong. Wallis toured China, and while in Beijing stayed with Catherine and Herman Rogers, who were to remain her long-term friends. According to the wife of one of Win's fellow officers, Mrs. Milton E. Miles, in Beijing Wallis met Count Galeazzo Ciano, later Mussolini's son-in-law, and foreign minister, had an affair with him, and became pregnant, leading to a botched abortion that left her infertile. The rumor was later widespread, but never substantiated, and Ciano's wife, Eda Mussolini, denied it. The existence of an official China dossier is denied by most historians and biographers. Wallis spent over a year in China. By September 1925, she and her husband were back in the United States, though living apart. Their divorce was finalized on the 10th of December 1927. Second marriage. By the time her marriage to Spencer was dissolved, Wallis had become involved with Ernest Aldridge Simpson, an Anglo-American shipping executive and former officer in the Coldstream Guards. He divorced his first wife, Dorothea, to marry Wallis on the 21st of July 1928, at the Register Office in Chelsea, London. Wallis had telegraphed her acceptance of his proposal from Cannes, where she was staying with her friends, Mr. and Mrs. Rogers. The Simpsons temporarily set up home in a furnished house with 4 servants in Mayfair. In 1929, Wallis sailed back to the United States to visit her sick mother, who had married legal clerk Charles Gordon Allen after the death of Raisin. During the trip, Wallis' investments were wiped out in the Wall Street crash, and her mother died penniless on the 2nd of November 1929. Wallis returned to England and, with the shipping business still buoyant, the Simpsons moved into a large flat with a staff of servants. Through a friend, Consuelo Thor, Wallis met Consuelo's sister Thelma, Lady Furness, the then mistress of Edward, Prince of Wales. On the 10th of January 1931, Lady Furness introduced Wallis to the prince at Borough Court, near Melton Mowbray. The prince was the eldest son of King George V and Queen Mary, an heir apparent to the British throne. Between 1931 and 1934, he met the Simpsons at various house parties, and Wallis was presented at court. Ernest was beginning to encounter financial difficulties, as the Simpsons were living beyond their means, and they had to fire a succession of staff. Relationship with Edward, Prince of Wales. In January 1934, while Lady Furness was away in New York City, Wallis allegedly became the prince's mistress. Edward denied this to his father, despite his staff seeing them in bed together as well as evidence of a physical sexual act. Wallis soon ousted Lady Furness, and the prince distanced himself from a former lover and confidant, the Anglo-American textile heiress Freda Dudley Ward. By the end of 1934, Edward was irretrievably besotted with Wallis, finding her domineering manner and abrasive irreverence toward his position appealing. In the words of his official biographer, he became slavishly dependent on her. According to Wallis, it was during a cruise on Lord Moyne's private yacht Rosaura in August 1934 that she fell in love with Edward. At an evening party in Buckingham Palace, he introduced her to his mother. His father was outraged, primarily on account of her marital history, as divorced people were generally excluded from court. Edward showered Wallis with money and jewels, and in February 1935, and again later in the year, he holidayed with her in Europe. His courtiers became increasingly alarmed as the affair began to interfere with his official duties. In 1935, the head of the Metropolitan Police Special Branch told the Metropolitan Police Commissioner that Wallis was also having an affair with Guy Marcus Trundle, who was said to be employed by the Ford Motor Company. Claims of an affair were doubted, however, by Captain Val Bailey, who knew Trundle well and whose mother had an affair with Trundle for nearly 2 decades, and by historian Susan Williams. Abdication crisis. On the 20th of January 1936, George V died at Sandringham and Edward ascended the throne as King Edward VIII. The next day, he broke royal protocol by watching the proclamation of his accession from a window of St James's Palace, in the company of the still-married Wallis. It was becoming apparent to court and government circles that the new King Emperor meant to marry her. The king's behaviour and his relationship with Wallis made him unpopular with the Conservative-led British government, as well as distressing his mother and his brother, the Duke of York. The British media remained deferential to the monarchy, and no stories of the affair were reported in the domestic press, but foreign media widely reported their relationship. The monarch of the United Kingdom is supreme governor of the Church of England at the time of the proposed marriage, and until 2002. The Church of England disapproved of, and would not perform, the remarriage of divorced people if their former spouse was still alive. Constitutionally, the king was required to be in communion with the Church of England, but his proposed marriage conflicted with the Church's teachings. Additionally, at the time both the Church and English law only recognized adultery as a legitimate ground for divorce. Since she had divorced her first husband on grounds of mutual incompatibility, there was a possibility that her second marriage, as well as her prospective marriage to Edward, would be considered bigamous if her first divorce had been challenged in court. The British and Dominion governments believed that a twice-divorced woman was politically, socially, and morally unsuitable as a prospective consort. She was perceived by many in the British Empire as a woman of limitless ambition, who was pursuing the king because of his wealth and position. Wallis had already filed for divorce from her second husband on the grounds that he had committed adultery with her childhood friend Mary Kirk, and the decree nisi was granted on the 27th of October 1936. In November, the king consulted with the British Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, on a way to marry Wallis and keep the throne. The king suggested a morganatic marriage, where he would remain king, but Wallis would not be queen. But this was rejected by Baldwin and the Prime Ministers of Australia, Canada, and South Africa. If the king were to marry Wallis against Baldwin's advice, the government would be required to resign, causing a constitutional crisis. Wallis' relationship with the king had become public knowledge in the United Kingdom by early December. She decided to flee the country as the scandal broke, and was driven to the south of France in a dramatic race to outrun the press. For the next 3 months, she was under siege by the media at the Villa Louvagie, near Cannes, the home of her close friends Herman and Catherine Rogers. At her hideaway, Wallis was pressured by the king's lord-in-waiting, Lord Brownlow, to renounce the king. On the 7th of December 1936, Lord Brownlow read to the press her statement, which he had helped her draft, indicating Wallis' readiness to give up the king. However, Edward was determined to marry Wallis. John Theodore Goddard, Wallis' solicitor, stated, "Client was ready to do anything to ease the situation. But the other end of the wicket, Edward VIII, was determined." This seemingly indicated that the king had decided he had no option but to abdicate if he wished to marry Wallis. The king signed the instrument of abdication on the 10th of December 1936. In the presence of his 3 surviving brothers, the Duke of York, the Duke of Gloucester and the Duke of Kent. Special laws passed by the parliaments of the Dominions finalized Edward's abdication the following day, or in Ireland's case 1 day later. On the 11th of December 1936, Edward said in a radio broadcast, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love." Edward left Britain for Austria, where he stayed at Schlossen-Sessfeld, the home of Baron Eugen and Baroness Kitty de Rothschild. Edward had to remain apart from Wallis until there was no danger of compromising the granting of a decree absolute in her divorce proceedings. Upon her divorce being made final in May 1937, she changed her name by deed poll to Wallis Warfield, resuming her maiden name. The couple were reunited at the Château de Cande, Mons, France, on the 4th of May 1937. Third marriage, Duchess of Windsor. Wallis and Edward married 1 month later on 3 June 1937 at the Château de Cande, loaned to them by French millionaire Charles Bedaux. The date would have been King George I's 72nd birthday. Queen Mary thought the wedding had been scheduled for then as a deliberate slight. No member of Edward's family attended. Wallis wore a Wallis blue Mainbocher wedding dress. The marriage produced no children. In November, Ernest Simpson married Mary Kirke. Edward was created Duke of Windsor by his brother, George VI, prior to the marriage. However, letters patent, passed by the new king and unanimously supported by the Dominion governments, prevented Wallis, now the Duchess of Windsor, from sharing her husband's style of Royal Highness. George V's firm view that the Duchess should not be given a royal title was shared by Queen Mary and George's wife, Queen Elizabeth. At first, the British royal family did not accept the Duchess and would not receive her formally, although the former king sometimes met his mother and siblings after his abdication. Some biographers have suggested that Wallis' sister-in-law, Queen Elizabeth, remained bitter towards her for her role in bringing George VI to the throne and for prematurely behaving as Edward's consort when she was his mistress. These claims were denied by Queen Elizabeth's close friends, such as the Duke of Grafton, who wrote that she never said anything nasty about the Duchess of Windsor, except to say she really hadn't got a clue what she was dealing with. On the other hand, the Duchess of Windsor referred to Queen Elizabeth as Mrs. Temple and Cookie, alluding to her solid figure and fondness for food, and to her daughter, Princess Elizabeth, as Shirley, as in Shirley Temple. The Duchess bitterly resented the denial of the royal title and the refusal of the Duke's relatives to accept her as part of the family. Within the household of the Duke and Duchess, the style, Her Royal Highness, was used by those who were close to the couple. According to the wife of former British Union of Fascists leader Oswald Mosley, Diana Mitford, who knew both Queen Elizabeth and the Duchess of Windsor, but was only friendly with the latter, the Queen's antipathy toward her sister-in-law may have resulted from jealousy. Lady Mosley wrote to her sister, the Duchess of Devonshire, after the death of the Duke of Windsor, probably the theory of the Windsors, contemporaries that Cake, a Mitford nickname for the Queen Mother, derived from her delighted exclamation at the party at which Deborah Devonshire first met her, was rather in love with him, the Duke, and took second best, may account for much. The Duke and Duchess lived in France in the pre-war years. In 1937, they made a high-profile visit to Germany and met Adolf Hitler at the Berghof, his Berchtesgaden retreat. After the visit, Hitler said of Wallis, she would have made a good queen. The visit tended to corroborate the strong suspicions of many in government and society that the Duchess was a German agent, a claim that she ridiculed in her letters to the Duke. US FBI files compiled in the 1930s also portray her as a possible Nazi sympathizer. Duke Karl Alexander of Württemberg told the FBI that she and leading Nazi Joachim von Ribbentrop had been lovers in London. There were even rather improbable reports during the Second World War that she kept a signed photograph of Ribbentrop on her bedside table. Second World War. As the German troops advanced, the Duke and Duchess fled south from their Paris home, first to Biarritz, then in June to Spain. There, she told the United States ambassador, Alexander W. Weddell, that France had lost, because it was internally diseased. In July, the pair moved to Lisbon, Portugal, where they stayed at the home of Ricardo do Espírito Santo e Silva, a banker who was suspected of being a German agent. In August 1940, the Duke and Duchess traveled by commercial liner to the Bahamas, where the Duke was installed as governor. Wallis performed her role as the Bahamas' First Lady competently for 5 years. She worked actively for the Red Cross and in the improvement of infant welfare. However, she hated Nassau, calling it our St. Helena, in a reference to Napoleon's final place of exile. She was heavily criticized in the British press for her extravagant shopping in the United States, undertaken when Britain was enduring privations such as rationing and the blackout. Her attitude towards the local population, whom she called lazy, thriving niggers, in letters to her aunt, reflected her upbringing. In 1941, Prime Minister Winston Churchill strenuously objected when she and her husband planned to tour the Caribbean aboard a yacht belonging to a Swedish magnate, Axel Wenner-Gren, who Churchill said was pro-German. Churchill felt compelled to complain again when the Duke gave a defeatist interview. Another of their acquaintances, Charles Bedaux, who had hosted their marriage, was arrested on charges of treason in 1943 and committed suicide in jail in Miami before the case was brought to trial. The British establishment distrusted the Duchess. Sir Alexander Harding wrote that her suspected anti-British activities were motivated by a desire for revenge against a country that rejected her as its queen. After the defeat of Nazi Germany, the couple returned to France and retirement. Brought to you by Wikividi Documentaries. Would you like to know more?